Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I'm here today to do a Friday Reads video, which I haven't done in a while because I was traveling in Ireland and Scotland. So if you want to jump to the actual Friday Reads portion of the video where I talk about the many books that I have read since the last time I spoke to you in a Friday Reads, there will be a timestamp in the description box down below, so you can jump to that. I read a bunch of books while we were traveling, and some of them were very good. There's some that I really loved, and there's at least one that I just hated and hate even more the more I think about it. So all of that will be at the Friday Reads portion, which you can jump to if you would like. But I like to have a chatty bit, and a lot of other people have said that they like to have a chatty bit. So here I am doing that. And this is a kind of fun one because we get to catch up and talk a little bit about the trip. We'll talk more about the trip when I have Joel here. We will do our monthly wrap-up probably over the weekend, and then you'll probably get it later next week. I did try to get Teddy here to film a video with me, and he was not into it because I'm filming this on Friday. Joel had to travel yesterday, just like a quick trip overnight, and he got home about 30 minutes ago. And Teddy has been like all over him. So I tried to get him into the video with me and he was like, no. So he's elsewhere right now, and we'll try to get him into the monthly wrap-up. I am wearing one of my souvenir t-shirts today. This is my Book of Kells shirt. It has some of the illustrations from the Book of Kells on it, obviously. If you follow along and you watched my last Friday Reads, you may remember that there had been some concern that we wouldn't be able to get into the Book of Kells and the old library at Trinity College because there were student protests and they had blocked access to both attractions because they're in the same building. I hadn't realized that, but they are in the same building in the old library. The Book of Kells is on the ground floor, and then you can go upstairs, which is where the old library is. It's that... I'll put a picture here. It's that old room with the long path and the arches and 2 floors. It's been a bucket list item of mine for a really long time. And I'm so glad that we were able to get in there and see it. It was a big moment. Sometimes when you have this sense of anticipation leading up to something, you kind of get there and it's not as impressive as it looks in photos. This was. And the way they had displayed the Book of Kells is really beautiful and dramatic. I joked to Joel that a gay man must have designed the room where they keep the Book of Kells because it's very dramatic and lit very well. And then the old library, it's beautiful. 95%, maybe even more of the books have been removed from the library at this moment because they're actually getting ready to do a renovation. I can't remember if the renovation is supposed to start at the end of this year or early 2025, but they're gearing up for it. And I believe the library is going to be closed for about a year. I could be wrong about that. So I'm glad we got in before all of that. But most of the books have been removed in anticipation of the renovation because they're obviously getting ready for it. And I could see how if you didn't know that the books were being removed or that they were getting ready for this renovation, it would be very surprising. There was a German tourist who walked up to Joel and I like, where are the books? And we explained that they were getting ready for that. There is a giant digital globe in the middle of the room, and I don't really think it needs to be there. I don't think it adds anything to the room. So if it were me, I would take it out, but it's fine. It's just, I'm glad that we got to go there. And we had such a good time on the trip. We spent some time in Dublin. We took a day trip up to Belfast and the Giant's Causeway, and it was raining that day, but the Giant's Causeway was still so cool. And we had a good tour guide on that day. We hopped over to Scotland. We had spent 1 full day in Inverness, so we could do a tour of the Isle of Skye and Elandonnan Castle. Elandonnan Castle was fantastic. The downside of a tour is that we didn't really have a whole lot of time there. We could pay like $3 to walk across the bridge and walk the grounds, but we didn't have time to do the tour of the castle itself. And I wish we'd had time for that, but oh well. Then we spent time walking around in Edinburgh. That was so fun. We walked so much. There was one day we walked almost 25,000 steps. I'm rounding up a little bit. It was more like 23,500, something like that. But we walked a lot. Our feet hurt, but it was worth every step that we took. It was so good. And then we went to Galway so we could do a tour of the Aran Islands and see the Cliffs of Moher. And it's a fun town to walk around. We actually ran into a subscriber. Hi, Ainsley. I don't know if you're watching this, but it was such a coincidence right outside a bookstore. How perfect was that? So we had a really good time. And we'll talk more about it when Joel is here. That's kind of the quick overview. And then we went back to Dublin and took a cooking class, which was fun. And we'll talk a lot more about the trip when Joel is here. I just wanted to quickly kind of run through because I know a lot of people had some questions about how the trip was. And Teddy did fine while we were gone. I do think Teddy is good at hiding anxiety. Like, we know him well enough at this point that we can tell when he's getting a little anxious. So I think he was probably a little more anxious than it looked like to the people who were watching him, but he did fine. He did do fine. We did have to have a conversation with him about how no means no, because apparently Teddy is something of a ladies' man and got very enthusiastic about several of the lady dogs that were there and didn't quite take the cues that they weren't as into him as he was into them. So he was playful, but yeah. So we had to have a conversation with him. No means no, but he's doing great. It really loved being home. He was excited to see us, but he was also excited to sniff all of the treats that are in the lobby of the place where he was staying. So he's doing fine. He had a good time as well. And yeah, so that's some trip stuff. The big event that happened, or there are two of them while we were traveling, is that the International Booker Prize was announced. It went to Kairos by Jenny Erpenbach. I believe the translator is Michael Hoffman. And because we were traveling, I didn't get to do a reaction to that or the Carol Shields Prize. Kairos, I've heard a lot of good things about. It does sound interesting. I don't really know at this point if I'm going to catch up to reading it. If you have read it, let me know what you thought of it in the comment section down below. But yeah, so that was the winner of the International Booker Prize. Brotherless Night by Vivi Ganeshananthan won the Carol Shields Prize. And that is particularly interesting because Brotherless Night is still in the mix for the Women's Prize, which will be announced June 13th, I believe. And we'll see what happens. I don't think it's going to win the Women's Prize, but it is... I always feel a little excited when there's potential for a book to win two big book prizes. It doesn't happen all that much. It did happen last year because Demon Copperhead co-won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and then went on to win the Women's Prize. But I don't think we're going to see Brotherless Night repeat. I think it's much more likely to be Soldier Sailor or Enter Ghost. And we'll see what happens on June 13th. I almost picked up a copy of Soldier Sailor while we were in Ireland and Scotland because it's everywhere. But I decided that since it's being published in the US, I would rather focus my attention on books that I can really only get in Ireland and Scotland. So that's why. I talked a lot about this in my book haul, which features all of the books that I purchased. It will be in the description box down below if you would like to check that out. YouTube appears to have changed the layout down below the video, and I'm not sure I like it. It really prioritizes other recommended videos for browsing and kind of hides the description box away to the side. So it makes it annoying to find the links and everything, but you know, I have no control over these things. It's fine. YouTube ultimately isn't going to care what I have to say about it, but it will be down below if you'd like to check it out. And then just quickly, I had mentioned in that book haul that I had a really great bookmark from The Winding Stair, which was my favorite bookstore in Dublin, and you can watch the book haul to find out why. And I had put it underneath my laptop. That's why I couldn't find it. So I have it now. First, there's actually a postcard of The Winding Stair, really beautiful postcard. So The Winding Stair is a bookshop on the ground level, and then above it is a restaurant. We did not eat at the restaurant, but we visited the bookstore, I think 3 times in total when we were in Dublin. So really great store, beautiful postcard that I'm thinking I might find a space for on that wall behind me, but we shall see. And here is the bookmark that I was talking about from The Winding Stair. I'm going to try to hold it so you can see it with the light. It's got a puppy. So that's the first great thing about it. But the other thing is that I mentioned that one of the things I really loved about it is that I asked for some recommendations from an employee, and she said, okay, well, I think I have an idea of what to get. Why don't you go have a seat in the back, and I'll bring a pile of books for you to review. And it was a chair very much like this in the back room. So not only does it have a puppy, not only is it from the store, it ties in with my memory of the store and one of the things that made it my favorite bookstore in Dublin. So that's a great bookmark right there. And the only other business before we get into the Friday Reads portion is that I just want to mention a channel. So I kind of mentioned it already. Well, not kind of. I did mention it already in a video that posted while I was gone, the quarter year crisis video. And it was about, there was a question about channels that I have discovered and would recommend. At that time, there was only one video on Lydia Lost the Plot's channel. There are now more, and I watched one of them this morning. She loved my beloved The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, so I'm going to mention that video, or that channel again. I also love the name Lydia Lost the Plot, so I will link her channel down below. Feel free to check it out, and if you enjoy it, subscribe, because it's a fun new channel, and who doesn't love discovering fun new channels? So that will be down below. I am also hoping to film my Pulitzer Prize deep dive on Night Watch today. If I manage to do that, I will try to edit it today and schedule it. I might schedule it for Sunday, which would be the day after this video post. But all of that is dependent on whether or not I manage to film and edit it today. So we shall see. If I can't have it for Sunday or Monday, I'll try to have it ready for you on Tuesday. It's coming. It's coming. And we'll talk more about Night Watch later on in the Friday Reads portion of this video, because it's one of the books that I finished. So I'm glad everybody enjoyed the videos that I had scheduled for while I was gone. I'm trying to catch up on comments, but I'm also catching up with work. So I feel like the more days I'm home and haven't caught up on the comments, the less likely it will be. I'm going to try. I really want to try to catch up on the comments. But so if you left one, I'm going to try. I probably saw it, but I haven't managed to reply. So I'm going to do my best to see what I can do. But right now I'm kind of in the middle of trying to catch up on work and film additional content like this Friday Reads video. So please bear with me while I do all of those things. Let's get into the actual Friday Reads portion of this video, because I want to cover a lot of the books that I read while we were gone, because most of my reading in the month of May is stuff that I read while we were traveling. So if I can cover a lot of these now, there will be more time to discuss other things in the monthly wrap-up that I do with Joel, because then we can talk about the books he read in the month of May, and we can talk about the books that he got while we were traveling, because he got some cookbooks and a photo book. So we can talk about those in the monthly wrap-up, and we can talk a little bit more about the trip and all of that fun stuff. I could tell you about Duningasa. I loved Duningasa. We saw a shark from this cliff face. It was amazing. And actually, I did get a comment on Instagram. If you want to see these photos, my Instagram account is always linked down below. I have 2 saved stories on my profile that cover all of Ireland and Scotland. The video of the shark is in there. So somebody said it's a dolphin. They said, we don't have sharks that are that big out in this part of the world. But there were 4 or 5 species of shark that they said to look out for at the visitor center for Duningasa. So my neighbor happens to have been a biologist in a former life, so I showed him the video, and he says it's a shark, and I am going to go with that. So anyway, we'll talk about all of those things in the video. So if I cover all of my books that I've read since the last time I talked to you pretty thoroughly now, I don't have to spend a lot of time talking about them in the monthly wrap-up. So let's just start talking about them. This one I had started, I believe, because I know I talked about it in the last Friday Reads video that I shared with you. It's I'm So Glad We Had This Time Together, a memoir by Maurice Villecoup. So the selling point for this one is that it's a memoir, a graphic memoir about his relationship with his mother, because they were very close when he was a child. I even showed you the opening of the book. It's very handy that I just opened to that, where it says, once upon a time, my mom and I were so in love, it was almost like we were one seamless being. A perfect team like Ginger and Fred, Captain Kangaroo, and Mr. Green Jeans. But as he gets older, it becomes more apparent that he is gay, and he comes from a very religious family. His parents were both, I believe, Dutch immigrants to Canada. And that creates a tension and a division between him and his mother. And that is the framework of the book. It does open with his relationship with his mother, and it does come back to that at the end. But the majority of this book, like everything in between, is more of a graphic memoir about him growing up, realizing that he is gay, coming out, and ultimately coming to terms with who he is, which is a fascinating story arc. This would be a great book to read if you are looking for queer stories to read in June for Pride Month. I have my pile of possibilities video that already went up, and I'll link it in the description box down below. But if you're looking for something, this would be great. I got it from the library, and it is heavy. I had mentioned that too, but it was a great book, and I'm glad that I read it. And it's a graphic memoir, so it read very quickly. I apologize that the light is a little glaring. But yeah, I really liked this. I'm glad that I read it. Perfect recommendation for Pride Month if you need one. I just feel like it was sold a lot more on the dynamic between him and his mother, and that's actually a much smaller part of the book, although it is sort of the linchpin. It opens and closes with it, but it gets away from it for large parts of the middle. That would be my only complaint, really, about it. It is compared to Fun Home a lot, and it's tough to make those comparisons because when you love something like Fun Home, like the way that I love Fun Home, it sets the expectation really high. I think this is definitely in the same vein, but Fun Home is better, in my opinion. So that was the first book that I read since the last time, or finished since the last time I spoke to you. The next one is something Joel and I listened to on audio. So tickets were significantly cheaper if we flew out of Seattle instead of Missoula, where we live. So we drove from Missoula to Seattle, which is like a 9-hour drive. And we listened to Holiday Heartstrings by N.R. Walker on the drive over. N.R. Walker is one of our go-to cinnamon bun queer romance authors. And this really did not disappoint. Last year, we listened to the 3 previous books in this series. I can't remember if it's called the Heartbridge series. I think it is. They're all set in a fictional town in Montana called Heartbridge, and all of them are set at Christmas. There is a sense of sameness to the books a little bit, because the first 2 books have an Australian character who comes to the town of Heartbridge, or accidentally ends up in the town of Heartbridge, falls in love with a local, and it kind of goes from there. A lot of them have a sort of coming out element, because a character who is either bisexual or has been hiding his sexuality comes out in the process of the book. And, at this point, you would think people would there's a burgeoning gay population in Heartbridge. So you'd think people would be learning, like, you don't have to be afraid all that much. But so the beats of the story are a little bit repetitive, but N.R. Walker is really good at that. And the connections that develop between the protagonists are really good. And that's what I come to a romance novel for. And this one might be my favorite because although the story beats are familiar, although at this time it is a British person who comes to the town of Heartbridge, not an Australian, the beats are familiar. But one of the things I really love about it is that the characters from the previous book are creating this wonderful, supportive, loving community in Heartbridge at this point. It's almost like a found family situation. And I really love that dynamic that's developing throughout the course of these books. So it was great. It was cinnamon bun magic. It was everything we needed. And it was perfect for that drive from Missoula to Seattle. And if you're looking for something cinnamon bun and great, I would recommend them. People tend to ask about the spice level of books, and the spice level in the N.R. Walker books kind of varies. There usually is at least 1 or 2 sex scenes, and they can get a little bit explicit. But for me, the story is much more about the characters and their connection. So I don't know if it's helpful to anyone who wants to avoid the spice level, but I find it pretty easy to focus on the characters, the connection, and the story rather than the spice. So hopefully that's helpful if you are one of those people. So then we got on the plane, and I kind of front-loaded myself with ebook options and audio options so I could get over to Ireland. I don't typically read ebooks. I am never quite sure why, but I have attitude about reading ebooks. I don't like doing it. So it can be a difficult thing for me. But I knew that once we were in Ireland and Scotland, I would probably be visiting books. Probably, he says. I knew I would be visiting bookstores in Ireland and Scotland. And the difference with Ireland and Scotland and our trip to Italy is that I can't read Italian. So books as souvenirs weren't, I still did get 4 books as souvenirs, but they weren't things for me to read necessarily. They were books, Italian editions of books that I already loved. So Ireland and Scotland, that's not the thing. And Ireland has a reputation, even though it is a relatively small country, it has a lot of really great writers. And one thing I think I have learned is that Irish people in general are good storytellers. All of our tour guides, I could just listen to them talk all day. A waiter or waitress or like a bartender, you could talk to someone in Ireland all day. They're great natural storytellers. I think there's just a great storytelling tradition in Ireland. So ultimately, it doesn't feel that surprising that they have so many great storytellers. But anyway, I've gone on a tangent because I knew that I would be picking up books as we traveled along. So if I front loaded myself with ebooks and audio, and the audio is, we'll get to it, I would be able to get there, and then I could start reading actual physical books again. So Brick by M. Tasia is something I read on the plane. Joel has read a bunch of M. Tasia's books and enjoyed them. He finds them to be like really good diversions, especially if you are reading something before bed. And kind of cinnamon bun. They're queer romances. This is a series about, well, it's funny. It sounds like a spoiler because in this book, Brick, the private investigation agency hasn't started yet. So it kind of feels like a spoiler that that's what the series is. However, that is what the series is. It's about a bunch of gay men working at a private investigations agency. And in each book, they each find a romance, I guess. And there's probably a mystery that goes along with them. I didn't like it anywhere near as much as N.R. Walker, but it was very short. It's like 100 pages. And it took like an hour for me to read the ebook on the plane. And I have trouble sleeping on planes. So it was good for me to have a little bit of a distraction like that. So it suited the purpose for what I needed. But, and I don't know if I would go back to do more M. Tasia, maybe. Like I said, it was really short and quick. And I think that's one of the things that Joel really likes about these books. So we'll see. It was fine, I would say. And that got me to Ireland, where the next book is actually something that I picked up in Dublin when we were touring bookstores. So I got this one at Hodges Figgis. Hodges Figgis is a large independent bookstore. It's huge. It actually feels like going into a Barnes & Noble, but it's not a chain. I don't think it's a chain, at least. It's actually mentioned in James Joyce's Ulysses. If you walk up the stairs to the second level where the fiction section is, they have a mural with the paragraph that mentions Hodges Figgis, which is just interesting. Because, of course, people in Dublin are really into Ulysses by James Joyce. Go figure. Anyway, it's Amongst Women by John McGahern. John McGahern was mentioned in Nuala O'Foylin's memoir, Are You Somebody?, which I read last year. I think they may have dated at some point, but I can't quite remember. And her mention of him made me curious about his work. The only one of his books I could find in the U.S. was By the Lake. And I have a copy of it somewhere around here. But I hadn't read it before we left. But Amongst Women is his most famous book. It was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. So I was very curious to track it down. And his books are widely available in Ireland. So I looked at it. And Hodges Figgis had a whole display dedicated to him because another one of his books, I think it was called That They May Face the Rising Sun, has just been adapted into a movie that is in Irish movie theaters right now. We didn't see it, but I have no idea if it's ever going to be released in the United States. But Amongst Women is the book of his that I picked up. And I loved this book very much. It's definitely in my top 5 for favorite books of the year. So far, at least. It might be my number 1. I have to settle that by the end of June when I do my mid-year book freak out video. And when Joel and I will do our mid-year check-in point video. But I really loved this. So this is the story of a family. You have a man named Moran, who I thought it was Moran, but I actually saw a video of John McGahern talking about the book, and he said Moran. So I'm going with that. So Moran had been a soldier in the War for Independence. And he carries trauma from that, but he's, living in a time when people don't necessarily understand trauma and post-traumatic stress and all of that stuff. And he doesn't carry a lot. He carries it, but it's not really severe. But he's definitely struggling with things that he can't really reconcile. And he carries a lot of baggage from his time with the war. Like, he has a friend who had been in his, I guess, would you call it an infantry group, who has done really well for himself. And part of how he's done really well for himself is taking the pension. And Moran is a little bit disillusioned because he looks around at where the country is and he feels like, what are we fighting for? Did we replace one bad thing with another bad thing? So he doesn't take the pension, and he's a very complicated and prickly figure. I saw a review somewhere that said, what an infuriating character. And to me, that's like, well, yeah, that's the point. He's a very complicated and prickly man. So I also saw a review, I think it was in Kirkus, that said it's bizarre that it's called Amongst Women, which kind of points you toward the women in the story, but they feel, I guess the complaint was a little bit like something I used to say about the Virgin Suicides, where it's ostensibly about the Lisbon sisters, but you're always at a remove from the Lisbon sisters. You're seeing them through the prism of the boys that were in the neighborhood where they grew up. And actually, I find that fascinating in hindsight. And I really disagree with that portrayal of the women here, because to me, the women are the most important people in the book. This is a story about a family, and the men, like Morin, his oldest son Luke, his youngest son Michael, are kind of mess ups. And they kind of do what they please. Morin lords over the family and can be very vindictive. They all kind of wrap around his moods and his temperament in certain ways. But the women are the heart of the family, and they are actually the ones who are driving the family's sense of togetherness, keeping everything together. They are the most important people, even though they allow Morin to set the tone and act as it. I found that dynamic to be really fascinating, and I really loved this book. It's I love a book about a complicated family, so I was probably bound to love this. But the writing is also just really, it's beautiful, and all of the characters are complex, and you can see the ways they develop over time, because you start with the children being like children, and as they grow and develop, there are hurts and slights, and you can see how they become the people that they ultimately are. And you can still see the people that they used to be as well. I just thought it was really well done. It's a beautiful portrait of a family moving through time, ultimately. Like, it begins with Morin as an old man who's infirm, and then kind of goes back and tells the story of the family over the decades as the children grow up. And he tries to hold the family together, but he uses fear and intimidation a lot of the time. And that's not always the best way of doing things. But he doesn't see that because it's the way he has been always taught. So it's a really interesting book. I would highly recommend it. I just love this book. It can be difficult to track down if you're in the United States, but if you can find a copy or track it down, or you order it from overseas, because that is a thing that you can do these days, I would highly recommend this book. And it made me even more interested in reading more of John McGahern. So I have a copy of By the Lake. I actually found another one of his books at my local used bookstore just out of nowhere this week. So I'll talk about that in my June book haul. But Amongst Women by John McGahern was absolutely fantastic. I just loved it. Loved it, loved it, loved it. Then, so I read that while we were traveling around early on in the trip. After we had hopped over to Scotland, while we were in Edinburgh, we went to the Golden Hare, another beautiful bookstore. That was my favorite bookstore in Edinburgh. And that's where I got Dancing in the Shallows by Claire Redaway. It's from a Fairlight Moderns. I've actually been looking at other titles from Fairlight Moderns, and I'm really interested in at least one of them. So I would, check out my book haul. I talk more about that, but definitely a publisher I think worth looking at, because it seems like they do a lot of really interesting stories. So this one is another complicated family saga. You have a woman named Isla who unexpectedly inherits a cottage on the Isle of Skye. And one of the things I really liked about this is we visited the Isle of Skye. So it was fun to read a book that was set on the Isle of Skye. So at first she's going to sell this cottage on the Isle of Skye because she doesn't want it. And she didn't even really know her grandfather who left it to her. She'd only met him once, because it's her father's father, and she's estranged from her father. She hasn't really seen her father since she was 7 or 8 years old. So she only met the grandfather one time, and now he left a cabin to her, but she's feeling aimless in life. She feels like she's stuck in a rut. She doesn't know what she wants to do. She feels like she should be doing more, and she feels lost. So she decides, you know what, I'm just going to go stay at the cottage. And then she ends up staying, and she gets to know the community on the Isle of Skye and becomes part of them. And what's interesting as well is that this book allows her to mess up a little bit. Like, some of the things she does early on in the book are a little infuriating, because it's so obvious on the outside to be like, this is such a mistake. You are being so self-destructive right now. Get your life together. But that's kind of the point. it's not a blind spot of Claire Redaway's. Like, she's going to reckon with the choices that she's making over time. And you also get to know her mother, and you meet her mother as a woman who's sort of a perfectionist, avoids anything risky, very risk averse, likes to do the safe thing. But then you go back and you hear a little bit about the mother's story, and you find out why she got to rely on the safe choices or the safe path and all of that stuff. And you get to know her father and find out why they got to be estranged and his opinion on that situation. And then you get to know his father and find out what his backstory was that made him have a bit of a difficult relationship with his son. And you go back another generation, and this sounds overly complicated, but it really actually works. You go back another generation and find out about the grandfather's mother, who was a seaweed expert, and her story and how she wanted to become a scientist, but the strictures of the time, especially since she is a woman, made it difficult for her to do that. It's a very charming book, a complicated book, but it flows very easily, and I enjoyed this book. It is actually available on Bookshop, so I have a link to this and all of the other ones that are available in the US down below. I would recommend checking it out if you are thinking about something to read. So the summary on this one is that it is easy to read, it flows really well, and it is a charming little story about a family. You know, I love a complicated family story, and this kind of fits. It even opens with a family tree of the characters that you are about to meet in the book. And even though I can see somebody reading the first 100 pages and saying, Isla is infuriating, but I would say if that happens to you, stick with it, because she's on a journey in the book, and she definitely progresses from there. So that is Dancing in the Shallows by Claire Redaway, which is actually available in the US, as I said, and you can find links to anything that is available in the US to bookshop.org in the description box down below. Now, on the way to Ireland, on the plane, I started the audio for this year's Pulitzer Prize winner for fiction, Night Watch by Jane Ann Phillips. And there are a lot of reasons why I got about halfway through the book on the flight over, and I didn't pick it up in the next 2 weeks as we were traveling around. Part of that is that we were busy. When we got back to the hotel room, I was a little bit tired, and most of the time I spent when back in the hotel room, we would keep a journal of the trip. So in the evenings, we would catch up on our journal, talk about the things that had happened in that day, and then I would get all the photos that I had taken from that day together and make a set of stories for Instagram out of it. And so it didn't have a lot of time for audio. But the other thing is that I really wasn't liking the book, so I felt very resistant to diving back into it. But on the flight back, I picked it back up, and I did finish it. And heading into the last 2 hours, I took a break. I listened to another hour, and then I had 2 hours left, and I took a little bit of a break. And really, it just comes down to that I was irritated with the book and could tell I wasn't going to really like where it went. But I decided, all right, I'm just going to do it. I'm going to rip off the Band-Aid, finish this book. And then we came home, and the copy that I had ordered when it won was here. I'll have my reaction to the Pulitzer Prize down below. And it didn't get better. I was so annoyed with this book by the time I finished it. And in the time since I finished it, that irritation has turned into a pretty intense dislike of this book. And I'll talk a lot more about that when I do my Pulitzer Prize deep dive on this. I have already finished the text of that deep dive. I just need to try to film it. I'm hoping I will be able to film it today again. And then if I get it filmed today, I'm hoping I'll have it Sunday or Monday. If I don't have it Sunday or Monday, I'll try to get it to you by Tuesday. So just stay tuned, because I have the text ready. I just need to film it and edit it and then schedule it. So that will be the difficult part. But because I have that deep dive coming, I don't really want to get into it here. The thing I will mention is that a bunch of people had commented when it won that there are trigger warnings for this book, specifically for sexual assault. And if that is a trigger for you, even in any minor way, do not read this book. There is an extended and detailed scene of sexual assault in this book, and it is brutal. And one thing I say this in my deep dive, you could say that the fact that it is so unsettling is proof that Jane Ann Phillips is a great writer. Well, I don't think that's actually necessarily true. And I don't need to be traumatized to read a book about trauma. So that is one of the things that has made me angry at this book in the time since. And then just to kind of hammer in the point, I'll save most of my discussion for the video, but here is what I texted to one of the co-owners of Montana Book Company about it. Lots of unnecessarily complicated plot contrivances, weird, hooey, mystic stuff that also seems to fetishize disfigurement, and a plot that so obviously sets up a big reveal but then keeps making you wait for the reveal to happen, and then when it finally does, it makes it seem pointless. So stay tuned for the deep dive. It will be coming, but I did not like that book. So stay tuned for all of the reasons why in the deep dive, and we'll talk about my feelings about it as a winner with everything else that was a contender last year. Let's talk about something happier right now, happier in that I really liked the book. Small Joys by Elvin James Mensah. This is another book that really deals with mental health and trauma and all of that stuff. So that's why I hesitated after calling it happy, although it is titled Small Joys. So in this book, which is loosely inspired by Elvin James Mensah's life to some degree, I don't know how much of it is fictionalized and how much of it actually comes from his own experience, but it seems to come from a lot of his own life. You have a man named Harley who has recently dropped out of university, and he is at a moment of despair. He goes into the woods intending to harm himself. And while he is in the woods, he runs into another young man named Muddy, or nicknamed Muddy. And Muddy, it turns out, is his new roommate. He has been moving back into the apartment of his friend Chelsea. And since he went to uni, she got another roommate, and that is Muddy. So they happen to meet in this coincidence, but, Muddy ends up becoming sort of a safe haven for Harley, and they develop this friendship. Harley is Black and queer and dealing with a lot of trauma and grief and hatred of himself that he has, to a large degree, learned from his father. His father is a very religious man. And one of the things that is interesting about this is that it doesn't just paint the father as like a single note of like what a father who was born in Africa would be like, because you have a friend of his named Noria who also has an African father, and he is the polar opposite of Harley's father. And then there are other Black male figures who come in and complicate the notion of how this isn't the way it has to be. And I appreciated that nuance in the book. So Harley's father is very oppressive and angry about the son for him being gay, but also because his mother died during childbirth, and they have this very complicated relationship, and Harley has internalized all of that stuff. So this is a book that is really heavily dealing with grief, and if that is something that would be difficult for you, this would probably be a very difficult read. Obviously, since it opens with him thinking about self-harm, there is a lot of suicidal ideation in the book, so that would be another trigger for you to think about. I can definitely see someone reading this and thinking that a lot of the language is cheesy, because Harley comes to a lot of realizations, and he really grapples with things about grief and realizations about life and how life doesn't have to be the way he assumed that it was. He doesn't have to accept blame. And when he realizes those things, I can see someone feeling like it's cheesy. I don't think it's cheesy at all. I found it very nuanced and sweet, and the dynamic between the protagonists is really interesting and sweet. I will say the female characters, Chelsea and Noria, feel sidelined a fair amount. And part of me wanted a little bit more of their dynamic in the book. Like, they will kind of disappear from the friend group, not necessarily at the same time, but it's almost like you can only have one of them at a time. So you'll have a couple of scenes with Noria and Harley hanging out, and then all of a sudden Noria will fade out of the book and Chelsea will come back. And then there will be parts where the whole friend group is together, but it does feel like the women are sidelined a little. And yet there are so many interesting dynamics, because his relationship with Chelsea, he feels like he can't burden her with his grief, and that gets complicated and nuanced over time. And then Noria is his first real Black friend, and she helps him come to terms with a lot of things about himself and things that he expected. As I said, he has an idea that this is the way things need to be. And he meets Noria, and it doesn't actually have to be that way. He opens up to himself as a person and a figure in Black culture. And that is a really interesting dynamic. And then you have Muddy and the friendship that they form, which is really interesting and sweet in a lot of ways. And there's another character named Finley, who is Muddy's best friend, at least up until he meets Harley. And Finley feels like a very prickly, homophobic person at first, but again, you kind of go on journeys with him and discover that he's actually a good friend and a sort of stand-up guy. And I love the relationships and dynamics that happen and the way people aren't always what you expect them to be when you meet, and life isn't always what you expect it to be. I thought this was a really great and, again, nuanced, I keep using that word, but a very nuanced book. And it is available in the US. The cover is different. I actually like this cover better. It had just come out in paperback in the UK. So this is something I picked up at Golden Hare Books in Edinburgh. And I really loved it. I would absolutely recommend it to you. But again, I would say keep those triggers in mind. It does deal a lot with suicidal ideation. It does really put you in the head of someone who has suppressed all joy in his life and who is depressed and struggling with demons and baggage that he is carrying with him. And, you know, if that's a trigger for you, it could feel like you're drowning in those things because he so heavily needs to address them in his life as he moves forward. But I thought it was a really beautiful book, a very sweet book, and an interesting way of looking at life and friendship and found family and growing up and learning to accept yourself and who you are and finding other people who will accept you as well. And that notion of found family, again, I really enjoyed it and I would recommend it to you. So that's everything that I read. What am I doing now? Well, I had actually started the audio. I kind of waffled back and forth about what I was going to do on audio once I finished Nightwalk. I took a couple of days to emotionally recover from that book and my hatred of it. And I caught up on a lot of podcasts after we got home. And then I started thinking, what am I going to do on audio next? And I wanted to do something that would kick off my Pride reading. So again, my Pride Month Pile of Possibilities will be linked down below. I decided to listen to Tin Man by Sarah Winman on audio because the audio was just available on Libby, as it turned out. So I downloaded it immediately. And now that I finished Small Joys last night as I'm filming this, and I actually don't know what I'm going to do because Sarah Winman actually reads the audio and she does a fantastic job, but the language is really beautiful. And I kind of feel like I might actually want to read the book, like the physical book, so I can spend time. This happens to me sometimes. Like Toni Morrison reads a lot of the audios of her own books. And I love her voice and I want to, but I feel like the first time I read the books, I want to spend time with the words on the page, especially for Toni Morrison, because her works can be so dense. And I feel like I'm having a similar experience here where it's like, although the audio is fantastic, I feel like I want to sit with the book. So now that I've finished Small Joys, I think I might put the audio of Tin Man to the side and read the book. And I haven't decided if that is actually what I'm going to do yet. So this is the next book I'm reading. I just haven't really decided if I'm going to stick to the audio or if I'm going to pivot to the print book. And if I pivot to the print book, I'm going to have to choose another audio. And if I stick with the audio, I need to choose my next print book. So all of that is to be decided. But I'm finally reading Tin Man, everyone. I'm finally doing it. And it is beautiful. I had gotten, I think, 10% of the way into the audio, so not very far. It is beautiful. Really beautiful. So the premise of this, I love the catchphrase, this is almost a love story, but it's not as simple as that. It's already kind of defying my expectations, but in a really interesting way. It's about, there's a friendship, these two men, Ellis and Michael, they meet and become friends when they're 12. And then you kind of skip ahead a bunch of years and Ellis is now married to a woman named Annie. But actually it opens with Ellis as a widower. And then it kind of moves back in time and you get all of those dynamics. And that's where it's sort of defying my expectations already. But yeah, anyway, you jump ahead and then Ellis is married to Annie and Michael is nowhere. So it's about what happens to their friendship and what happens to them and all of that. And it seems gorgeous. So this is the next thing that I am going to read. Again, I will have a lot more for you when we do our monthly wrap up. You'll get to hear what Joel read while we were traveling, see what he got as souvenirs and all that stuff. And maybe I can even get Teddy for you. So I'd love to hear what you've been up to and reading and loving and all of that stuff in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.